Ameliar-anne and the Green Umbrella by Constance Heward. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Elsie Selwyn. Her name was Ameliar-anne Stiggins. She was a pale child with black hair which she wore in curl rags from Friday night till Sunday morning. Her mother was poor and took in washing, because, besides Ameliar-anne, who was the eldest, there were some 5 other little Stigginses to feed. Now it happened one day just before Christmas that the 5 little Stigginsons had colds in their heads, so Mrs. Stiggins sat them in a ring in the kitchen with their feet in a tub of mustard and water. After that she put them into a big bed and gave them hot gruel to drink, while Ameliar-anne stood gloomily by and shook her head, which was covered with curl rags. The reason for the curl rags was that all the village children had been invited to a grand tea party at the squire's the next day, and Ameliar-anne was gloomy because it did not seem as if the 5 little Stigginsons would be able to go. Sure enough, the next day the colds were worse, and at 3 o'clock in the afternoon Ameliar-anne's hair was taken out of the rags, and she put on her Sunday dress and coat and hat, and started off to the tea party with 25 ringlets bobbing round her neck. And the 5 little Stigginsons sat up in the big bed and howled horribly with disappointment. But Ameliar-anne had hardly gotten out of the front door before she was back again. "I want the umbrella," she said, and she took it from the corner in the parlor where it lived. It was large and green, with a goose's head for a handle. "It's never going to rain, Ameliar-anne," said Mrs. Stiggins. "Whatever do you want to take the umbrella, for I don't know." But Ameliar-anne tossed her head and said she wasn't so sure about the rain, and she started off again with the green umbrella clasped in one arm. The squire was a jolly old man, with a round red face and a beard like Father Christmas. But the squire's sister, Miss Josephine, was a cross old maid, and she thought it was a stupid thing to give a tea party to the village children. She was always there to see that they behaved themselves. Now Miss Josephine's eagle eye was upon Ameliar-anne as she took her seat at the great long table with the other children, and, "Amelia-anne Stiggins," she said, "what are you doing with that great umbrella in here? You ought to have left it in the hall with your coat and hat." "Oh, nothing, please, Mum," stammered Ameliar-anne, trying to hide the umbrella under the table, and Miss Josephine stared very hard at her, and then went on to find fault with somebody else. What a tea that was! There were cakes with pink icing and cherries on the top, and jam tarts that melted in one's mouth, and biscuit with creamy insides, and scones and buns. Ameliar-anne seemed to be terribly hungry, for her plate was nearly always empty, but though she did not reach out and help herself, she was never allowed to wait long, because there was a great many smiling maids to pass the cakes and fill up the teacups. When tea was over, the children went back to the hall and put on their hats and coats. As they went out, a smart footman at the door gave each child an orange, an apple, and a bag of sweets. Ameliar-anne took her orange and apple and bag of sweets and said, "Thank you, sir." Ameliar-anne was almost the last to go because she had taken the wrong hat and had to go back into the house. She was ready to go through the door again when suddenly Miss Josephine stepped forward. "Amelia-anne Stiggins," she said, "I will put up your umbrella for you," and she took it firmly out of Ameliar-anne's hand. "Oh, Mum!" cried Ameliar-anne, and clutched Miss Josephine's arm. But Miss Josephine shook her off and held up the umbrella and shot it open, and out upon the floor, in the bright light that came from the hall lamp, fell jam tarts and iced cakes and biscuits and scones. "Greedy child!" said Miss Josephine, and Ameliar-anne covered her face with her hands and wept. But the squire looked down at the feast on the floor and patted Ameliar-anne kindly on the shoulder. "Come, come," he said. "It was your own tea you put in the umbrella. I know because I watched you, and you never ate anything at all." "Oh, sir," cried Ameliar-anne, uncovering her face, "I'm glad you saw, 'cause I didn't take a bit more'n what I could easy have ate, and the 5 of them's got colds in their heads, and when I left them they were all howling something awful, and I couldn't bear to go home and tell them everything and them not have a bite, as you might say." "Well, well," said the squire, "I thought there was somebody missing, and of course there will be 5 teas left over, and I think we could find a 6th, as this one is spoilt. John, to the smart footman, a basket, please, with cakes for 6 people. And John went like a shot, while Miss Josephine dropped the umbrella and walked slowly past Amelia-anne and the squire, with her nose in the air and a look of horrified disgust on her face. In 2 minutes John was back again with a huge basket covered with a white cloth, and 15 minutes later Amelia-anne staggered into the Stigginsons' house and upstairs to the bedroom with a huge basket on one arm and the green umbrella clutched in the other. And the 5 little Stigginsons sat up in bed with their eyes nearly starting out of their heads, and Mrs. Stiggins sat bump upon a chair because she said it gave her quite a turn when Amelia-anne took off the cover of the basket. For inside that basket were cakes enough for 6, and Mrs. Stiggins as well, and oranges and apples and bags of sweets, and when everybody had finished, Amelia-anne was sure that she must have eaten quite twice as much as she had meant to bring home in the green umbrella. End of Amelia-anne and the Green Umbrella by Constance Heward. Read by Elsie Selwyn.
How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content.
The Black Cats and the Tinker's Wife by Margaret Baker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. The Black Cats and the Tinker's Wife. Once upon a time there was a tinker. He tramped about the country with his bundle of tools slung over his shoulder, and his little wife tramped beside him. Would you like to know what was in the bundle she carried? Why, a silk handkerchief of golden yellow to tie over her hair on holiday and fair days, and a ball of yarn with which she was always knitting, and a loaf of bread, and all the money they had, and that was never more than a few silver pieces. Although the 2 bundles held all they possessed, the tinker and his wife were as happy as could be, and as they trudged along from one farmhouse to another, and one village to the next, he would whistle as merrily as a blackbird, and she would sing and laugh, and dance along the short-cropped grass by the roadside, poising on her pretty bare feet as lightly as a fairy. When at sound of his call some goodwife came out with a broken kettle or a leaking pan, he would sit down on the doorstep to mend it. And while he worked, his wife told tales of elves and dwarfs and water sprites to the children who gathered round. Then, when night came, they would take their supper of bread and a little bowl of milk, and lie down to sleep wherever they could find shelter, sometimes out of doors, sometimes in a cottage or barn. You would think there was no pleasanter way of living, yet sometimes when they passed through a village and saw through open doorways into the cozy sunny little rooms where the women were busied about their work, the tinker's wife would sigh and turn to look back many, many times. And at that the tinker would sigh too, and think sadly of how little he could earn. So little that perhaps he would never be able to give her a home at all. Now, one day it happened that there was a great storm, and towards evening it grew wilder and wilder. The wind came whirling and sweeping along, driving the rain and the hail before it in blinding sheets. The country was bleak and bare, not so much as a hedge or wall behind which to take shelter, and presently it grew so dark that one could not see an arm's length ahead. The tinker wrapped his wife in his tattered cloak, and they struggled on, but it was weary work fighting the storm. Then, suddenly, they saw a light before them. "It comes from some cottage," said the tinker. "We will knock and ask shelter." But when they came near, they found it was not a cottage, but a cave. There was a bright fire burning within. Above it hung an iron pot, and nearby stood a three-legged stool and a water pitcher. There was nothing strange in all that, but there was something very odd about the cave all the same, for sitting round the fire were more black cats than could easily be counted. Big ones and little ones, fat ones and lean ones, old ones and young ones, long-haired and short-haired, all kinds. "Who there within?" cried the tinker. Such a flurry as there was about the fire! Some of the cats ran to hide themselves, some sprang to the entrance, some with arched backs and stiffened tails stayed by the fire. "Ho there, friend!" cried the tinker again, and as no one answered, he stepped boldly inside and his wife followed. "Strange that there should be no one here," said he, "and there are more cats than I care about myself. But on such a night one must be grateful for any lodging." So they sat down by the fire, his wife on the three-legged stool and he on the ground beside her, and they warmed and dried themselves. And presently from this corner and from that the cats came creeping back and sat down opposite, staring and staring with their great green eyes. "Puss, puss, puss," coaxed the tinker's wife. But the cats only twitched their ears and stared till their eyes glistened red as though they were on fire inside. "They will be friendly enough when they see we wish them no harm," said she, and truly before long a little black kitten came rubbing against her foot and jumped into her lap. So the night passed away and the storm went down and it was morning. The tinker's wife packed up her little bundle ready to start again. "I wish," she said, and at that all the cats pricked up their ears. "I wish I could give thee thy wish," said the tinker. "I wish I had a little home to care for. I wish we might live in this cave." At that the tinker laughed. "Why, if that is not surprising," said he, "it is the very wish I should wish myself. Have thy wish till someone else comes." And she clapped her hands for joy. So the tinker went down the hillside alone, with his bundle of tools on his back, and his wife stood waving goodbye as long as she could see him. Then she went into the cave and swept down all the cobwebs with a bunch of heather, and chased the dust out of the corners, and went about and about till the cave was as clean and neat as could be. And the cats sat round the fire and stared as though it was the most surprising thing they had ever seen. When it drew near evening, she sat outside on the three-legged stool with her knitting in her hand ready to wave to the tinker as soon as he came in sight. And there he was, striding up the hill, and she ran to meet him and brought him into the cave, and they sat by the fire as they had done before. "Has not anyone come yet?" asked the tinker. "No," she answered, "and I am glad. 'Tis such a cozy little cave that I wish—" And at that all the cats pricked up their ears. "I wish I could give thee thy wish," said the tinker. "I wish we could live here always, and that there was another three-legged stool, then thou wouldst not need to sit on the ground." "Why, that is not surprising," quoth the tinker. "'Tis the very wish I would wish myself." And he laughed and kissed her. "And what news have you learned today?" she asked. "Strange news," said the tinker. "There lies a farm yonder with fields all untilled, and when I asked what had befallen, they told me that a witch had spirited away the plowman because his dog chased her cat, and no one has seen or heard of him since." At that one of the cats began a most mournful wailing, and all the others joined in. "Alas!" said the tinker's wife, "what a sad and sorrowful tale." Next day again the tinker went down the hillside alone, and his little wife kept house in the cave, and went about and about it till it was as neat and as clean as could be. And when he came back at evening, there she was sitting at the entrance with all the cats around her watching for him. "Has not anyone come yet?" he asked when they were seated by the fire. "No," she answered, "and I am glad. 'Tis such a pleasant cave that I wish—" and at that all the cats pricked up their ears. "I wish I could give thee thy wish," said the tinker. "I wish we could live here always, and that we had a little hive of bees to gather honey from the heather blossoms." "Now, if that is not surprising," quoth the tinker, "'tis the very wish I would wish myself." And he laughed and kissed her. "And what is the news thou hast learned today?" she asked. "Strange news," said the tinker. "In a home yonder, there is an old rag doll, and no little girl to nurse it. She made a face at the witch one day, and no one has seen or heard of her since." And at that the tiniest kitten began a most mournful wailing, and all the others joined in. "Alas," said the tinker's wife, "what a sad and sorrowful tale." And so it happened every day. When they sat by the fire at dusk, the tinker's wife had always a wish to wish: for a little goat to feed on the hillside and give them milk, or for a little brown bowl to hold the berries she gathered. This time for a rose tree to grow about the cave mouth, that time for a broom that she might sweep the dust away the better. And the tinker had always a sad and sorrowful tale to tell of people who had disappeared. There was the farmer's wife who had given the witch a scorched cake of bread, the little boy who had called names after her, the dairymaid who had not curtsied to her, the strolling player whose music did not please her, the lovers who had chosen to sit too near her cave to watch the moon, and at each of these tales one of the cats would begin to wail most dismally, and all the others would join in. So things went on for a long, long time, and it would have been hard to find anyone as happy as the tinker's wife as she went about and about the cave, making it so neat and clean, or as the tinker when he came striding up the hillside at the end of the day and saw her waiting to wave to him. Now, sometimes when the tinker told his strange tales, his wife would begin to wonder and ponder. "And can it be? And if it should be so," said she, and then she would stop and shake her head and sigh. One night she sat thinking longer than ever, and then, "I wonder what happened to them when they disappeared." And again, "Is it not more than a little strange that there are so many cats here, and all black?" And at last, "I wish—" "I wish I could give thee thy wish," said the tinker. "I wish these cats were changed back into what they ought to be." And behold, in less than the flick of an eyelid, there they stood, the little girl who had made a face, the boy who had called names, the ploughman, the lovers, the dairymaid, and all the rest. It would take a long, long time to tell how they thanked the tinker and his wife, how they laughed and cried for joy, and how happy they all were. "To think my wish should come true," marveled the tinker's wife. "All good wishes come true sometime," quoth the tinker. "There is another shall come true," cried the farmer's wife. "For as quickly as it can be led up the hillside, my best goat shall be yours." "And I will bring my little brown bowl," said the little girl. "And I will make the finest three-legged stool that ever was seen," said the ploughman. And in the same way spoke all of them. "But if this is the witch's cave, why has she not come back?" asked the tinker. But that was a question they could not answer. But I can tell you why. She was blown right off her broomstick in that terrible storm. "Suppose I had wished my wish long ago, would it have come true then?" asked the tinker's wife. And that was another question they could not answer. Neither can I, though I know that in the end good temper and happiness will always break evil spells. Presently the tinker was startled to feel something come rubbing against his leg. "Here is a cat which has not changed," he cried. "I cannot have wished hard enough," said his wife. So she wished again and again, and she wished this way, and she wished that way, but nothing happened. "He must be a real cat," she said, and so they all agreed. "Then he shall live with us always," said the tinker. So the tinker and his wife and the black cat lived together in the cave and were as happy as could be all the rest of their lives. And never another wish did the tinker's wife have to wish, for all her other wishes came true and she had everything she wanted. And that is the end of the story. End of The Black Cats and the Tinker's Wife by Margaret Baker.
How the Cobbler Cheated the Devil by Charles John Tibbits. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. It chanced that once upon a time, long years ago, in the days when strange things used to happen in the world, and the devil himself used sometimes to walk about in it in a barefaced fashion, to the distraction of all good and bad folk alike, he came to a very small town, where he resolved to stay a while to play some of his tricks. How it was, whether the people were better or were worse than he expected to find them, whether they would not give way to him, or whether they went beyond him and outwitted him, I don't know, and so cannot say. But sure it is that in a short while he became terribly angry with the folk, and at length was so disgusted that he threatened he would make them repent their treatment of him, for he would punish them in a manner which would show them his power. With that he flew off in a fury, and the folk, knowing with whom they had to deal, were very sad, thinking what terrible thing would overtake them, and at their wits' end to imagine how they might manage to escape the claws of the evil one. Accordingly it was decided to call a meeting of the townsfolk, to which all, old and young, should come to deliver their opinion as to the best course to be pursued, only those too old to walk, the sick, and the foolish being not called to the council. Very many different courses were proposed, and while these were being debated, a man rushed into the hall where the council was held, and informed them that their enemy was coming, for he had himself seen him making his way to the town, bearing on his shoulder a stone almost big enough to bury the place under it. He reported that the devil was yet a long way off, for his load hampered him sadly, and he could not travel fast. What to do the councillors did not know, when suddenly there came amongst them a poor cobbler, whom they had forgotten to call to the meeting, for he was indeed looked upon as only half-witted. "I will go and meet him," said he, "and stop him coming here." "You stop him!" cried they all. "It's mad you must be to think of it." "I'll go all the same," said the cobbler, and without saying a word more, he goes out and begins to make ready for his journey. First of all, he collected together as many old boots and shoes as he could find, and when he'd got them all in a bundle, he finds out the man who had seen the devil coming on, and inquired of him the way he should go to meet him. The man told him the road, and the cobbler set out. He walked and walked and walked, till at last he came to the devil, who was sitting by the roadside resting himself and trying to get cool, for the day was warm, and he was nearly worn out with carrying the big rock which lay beside him. "Do you know such and such a place?" asks he of the man, naming the town he would be at. "I do indeed," says the man, "for I ought to, seeing I have lived in its neighborhood these many years, and have only left there to travel here." "And how many days have you been getting here?" asked the devil anxiously, for he had hoped he was near the end of his journey. "Oh, days and days," replies the man. "See here," and he opens his bundle of old boots that he had ready. "See here," says he, "these are the boots I have worn out on the hard road in coming from the place to here." "Have you indeed?" says the devil, looking at them amazed, little thinking that the man was lying as he showed him pair after pair, all in holes and shreds. "Well, indeed it must be a long way off," and he looks around him, and then at the rock, and thinks what a terrible long way he has had to bring it, and begins to doubt whether, after all, since he's got so far to go, it's worth all the trouble. "If it had been near," says he, "it would have been a different thing, and I would have shown them what it is to treat me as they did. But as it's so far off, it's another matter, and I don't think it's worth the trouble." So he just takes up the rock and flings it aside in a field, and goes off back again. So the cobbler came home and told all the townsfolk what he had done, and how he had cheated the devil. And I can assure you that they all admired his cleverness, and the joke of tricking the devil as he had, nor did they allow him to lose in consequence of missing his day's work. End of How the Cobbler Cheated the Devil by Charles John Tibbits. Read by Colleen McMahon.
The Enchanted Knife by Anonymous. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Enchanted Knife. Once upon a time there lived a young man who vowed that he would never marry any girl who had not royal blood in her veins. One day he plucked up all his courage and went to the palace to ask the emperor for his daughter. The emperor was not much pleased at the thought of such a match for his only child, but being very polite, he only said, "Very well, my son, if you can win the princess, you shall have her, and the conditions are these. In 8 days you must manage to tame and bring to me 3 horses that have never felt a master. The first is pure white, the second a foxy red with a black head, the third coal black with a white head and feet. And besides that, you must also bring as a present to the Empress, my wife, as much gold as the 3 horses can carry." The young man listened in dismay to these words, but with an effort he thanked the emperor for his kindness and left the palace, wondering how he was to fulfill the task allotted to him. Luckily for him, the emperor's daughter had overheard everything her father had said, and peeping through a curtain had seen the youth and thought him handsomer than anyone she had ever beheld. So returning hastily to her own room, she wrote him a letter, which she gave to a trusty servant to deliver, begging her wooer to come to her rooms early the next day, and to undertake nothing without her advice, if he ever wished her to be his wife. That night, when her father was asleep, she crept softly into his chamber and took out an enchanted knife from the chest where he kept his treasures, and hid it carefully in a safe place before she went to bed. The sun had hardly risen the following morning when the princess's nurse brought the young man to her apartments. Neither spoke for some minutes, but stood holding each other's hands for joy, till at last they both cried out that nothing but death should part them. Then the maiden said, "Take my horse and ride straight through the wood towards the sunset till you come to a hill with 3 peaks. When you get there, turn first to the right and then to the left, and you will find yourself in a sun meadow where many horses are feeding. Out of these you must pick out the 3 described to you by my father. If they prove shy and refuse to let you get near them, draw out your knife and let the sun shine on it so that the whole meadow is lit up by its rays, and the horses will then approach you of their own accord and will let you lead them away. When you have them safely, look about till you see a cypress tree, whose roots are of brass, whose boughs are of silver, and whose leaves are of gold. Go to it and cut away the roots with your knife, and you will come to countless bags of gold. Load the horses with all they can carry, and return to my father, and tell him that you have done your task and can claim me for your wife." The princess had finished all she had to say, and now it depended on the young man to do his part. He hid the knife in the folds of his girdle, mounted his horse, and rode off in search of the meadow. This he found without much difficulty, but the horses were all so shy that they galloped away directly he approached them. Then he drew his knife and held it up towards the sun, and directly there shone such a glory that the whole meadow was bathed in it. From all sides the horses rushed pressing round, and each one that passed him fell on its knees to do him honor. But he only chose from them all the 3 that the emperor had described. These he secured by a silken rope to his own horse, and then looked about for the cypress tree. It was standing by itself in one corner, and in a moment he was beside it, tearing away the earth with his knife. Deeper and deeper he dug, till far down, below the roots of brass, his knife struck upon the buried treasure, which lay heaped up in bags all around. With a great effort he lifted them from their hiding place and laid them one by one on his horses' backs, and when they could carry no more, he led them back to the emperor. And when the emperor saw him, he wondered, but never guessed how it was the young man had been too clever for him, till the betrothal ceremony was over. Then he asked his newly made son-in-law what dowry he would require with his bride, to which the bridegroom made answer, "Noble emperor, all I desire is that I may have your daughter for my wife and enjoy forever the use of your enchanted knife." End of The Enchanted Knife by Anonymous. Read by Betty B.
Aesop's Fables, a version for young readers by Aesop and J. H. Stickney. The Frogs Who Asked for a King. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Frogs Who Asked for a King. There were once some frogs who lived together in a perfect security in a beautiful lake. They were a large company and were very comfortable, but they came to think that they might be still happier if they had a king to rule over them. So they sent to Jupiter, their god, to ask him to give them a king. Jupiter laughed at their folly, for he knew that they were better off as they were. But he said to them, "Well, here's a king for you," and into the water he threw a big log. It fell with such a splash that the frogs were terrified and hid themselves in the deep mud under the water. By and by, one braver than the rest peeped out to look at the king, and saw the log, as it lay quietly on the top of the water. Soon, one after another, they all came out of their hiding places and ventured to look at their great king. As the log did not move, they swam around it, keeping a safe distance away, and at last one by one hopped upon it. "This is not a king," said a wise old frog. "It is nothing but a stupid log. If he had a king, Jupiter would pay more attention to us." Again they sent to Jupiter, and begged him to give them a king who could rule over them. Jupiter didn't like to be disturbed again by the silly frogs, and this time he sent them a stork, saying, "You will have someone to rule over you now." As they saw the stork solemnly walking down to the lake, they were delighted. "Ah," they said, "see how grand he looks, how he strides along, how he throws back his head. This is a king indeed. He shall rule over us," and they went joyfully to meet him. As their new king came nearer, he paused, stretched out his long neck, picked up the head frog and swallowed him at one mouthful, and then the next, and the next. "What is this?" cried the frogs, and they began to draw back in terror. But the stork with his long legs easily followed them to the water, and kept on eating them as fast as he could. "Oh, if we had only been," said the oldest frog. He was going to add "content," but he was eaten up before he could finish the sentence. The remaining frogs cried to Jupiter to help them, but he would not listen, and the stork king ate them for breakfast, dinner, and supper every day, till in a short time there was not a frog left in the lake. Poor foolish frogs, not to have known when they were well off. End of The Frogs Who Asked for a King by Aesop and J. H. Stickney.
How the Camel Got His Hump. Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How the Camel Got His Hump. Now, this is the next tale, and it tells how the camel got his big hump. In the beginning of years, when the world was so new and all, and the animals were just beginning to work for man, there was a camel, and he lived in the middle of a howling desert because he did not want to work, and besides, he was a howler himself. So he ate sticks and thorns and tamarisks and milkweed and prickles, and most excruciatingly idle, and when anyone spoke to him, he said, "Humph!" Just humph, and no more. Presently, the horse came to him on Monday morning with a saddle on his back and a bit in his mouth and said, "Camel, oh camel, come out and trot like the rest of us." "Humph," said the camel, and the horse went away and told the man. Presently, the dog came to him with a stick in his mouth and said, "Camel, oh camel, come and fetch and carry like the rest of us." "Humph," said the camel,
and the dog went away and told the man. Presently the ox came to him, with the yoke on his neck, and said, "Camel, oh camel, come and plough like the rest of us." "Humph," said the camel, and the ox went away and told the man. At the end of the day, the man called the horse and the dog and the ox together and said, "Three, oh three, I'm very sorry for you, with the world so new and all, but that Humph thing in the desert can't work, or he would have been here by now. So I'm going to leave him alone, and you must work double time to make up for it." That made the three very angry, with the world so new and all, and they held a palaver and an indaba and a panchayat and a pow-wow on the edge of the desert. And the camel came chewing on milkweed, most excruciating idle, and laughed at them. Then he said, "Humph," and went away again. Presently there came along the Jinn in charge of all deserts, rolling in a cloud of dust. Jinns always travel that way because it is magic. And he stopped to palaver and pow-wow with the three. "Jinn of all deserts," said the horse, "is it right for anyone to be idle with the world so new and all?" "Certainly not," said the Jinn. "Well," said the horse, "there's a thing in the middle of your howling desert, and he's a howler himself, with long neck and long legs, and he hasn't done a stroke of work since Monday morning. He won't trot." "Whoo!" said the Jinn, whistling. "That's my camel for all the gold in Arabia. What does he say about it?" "He says, 'Humph,'" said the dog, "and he won't fetch and carry." "Does he say anything else?" "Only 'Humph,' and he won't plough," said the ox. "Very good," said the Jinn. "I'll humph him, if you will kindly wait a minute." The Jinn rolled himself up in his dust cloak and took a bearing across the desert, and found the camel, most excruciatingly idle, looking at his own reflection in a pool of water. "My long and bubbling friend," said the Jinn, "what's this I hear of your doing no work with the world so new and all?" "Humph," said the camel. The Jinn sat down with his chin in his hand and began to think a great magic, while the camel looked at his own reflection in the pool of water. "You've given the three extra work ever since Monday morning, on account of your excruciating idleness," said the Jinn, and he went on thinking magics, with his chin in his hand. "Humph," said the camel. "I wouldn't say that again if I were you," said the Jinn. "You might say it once too often. Bubbles, I want you to work." And the camel said, "Humph," again. But no sooner has he said that than he saw his own back that he was so proud of, puffing up into a great, big, lolloping humph. "Do you see that?" said the Jinn. "That's your very own humph that you've brought upon your very own self by not working. Today is Thursday, and you've done no work since Monday when the work began. Now you are going to work." "How can I," said the camel, "with this humph on my back?" "That's made a purpose," said the Jinn. "All because you missed those 3 days. You will be able to work now for 3 days without eating, because you can live on your humph. And don't you say I never did anything for you. Come out of the desert and go to the tree and behave. Humph yourself." And the camel humphed himself, humph and all, and went away to join the three. And from that day, the camel always wears a humph. We call it a hump now, not to hurt his feelings. But he has never yet caught up with the 3 days that he missed at the beginning of the world, and he has never yet learned how to behave. The camel's hump is an ugly lump which well you may see at the zoo, but uglier yet is the hump we get from having too little to do. Kiddies and grown-ups too, if we don't have enough to do, we get the lump, camelicious hump, the hump that is black and blue. We climb out of bed with a frowsly head and a snarly-yarly voice. We shiver and scowl and we grunt and we growl at our bath and our boots and our toys. And there ought to be a corner for me, and I know there is one for you, when we get the hump, the camelicious hump, the hump that is black and blue. The cure for this ill is not to sit still or frowst with a book by the fire, but to take a large hoe and a shovel also and dig till you gently perspire. And then you will find that the sun and the wind and the gin of the garden too have lifted the hump, the horrible hump, the hump that is black and blue. I get it as well as you, If I haven't enough to do, we all get the hump, Camelicious hump, kiddies and grown-ups too. End of How the Camel Got His Hump from Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling.
How the Indians Learned to Heal, an Iroquois wonder story of stories the Iroquois tell their children, collected by Mabel Powers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A long, long time ago, some Indians were running along a trail that led to an Indian settlement. As they ran, a rabbit jumped from the bushes and sat before them. The Indians stopped, for the rabbit still sat up before them and did not move from the trail. They shot their arrows at him. The arrows came back unstained with blood. A second time they drew their arrows. Now no rabbit was to be seen. Instead, an old man stood on the trail. He seemed to be weak and sick. The old man asked them for food and a place to rest. They would not listen, but went on to the settlement. Slowly, the old man followed them down the trail to the wigwam village. In front of each wigwam, he saw a skin placed on a pole. This, he knew, was the sign of the clan to which the dwellers in that wigwam belonged. First, he stopped at a wigwam where a wolf skin hung. He asked to enter, but they would not let him. They said, "We want no sick men here." On he went toward another wigwam. Here a turtle shell was hanging, but this family would not let him in. He tried a wigwam where he saw a beaver skin. He was told to move on. The Indians who lived in a wigwam where a deer skin was seen were just as unkind, nor was he permitted to enter the wigwam where hung hawk, snipe, and heron skins. At last he came to a wigwam where a bear skin hung. "I will ask once more for a place to rest," he thought. And here a kind old woman lived. She brought food for him to eat and spread soft skins for him to lie upon. The old man thanked her. He said that he was very sick. He told the woman what plants to gather in the wood to make him well again. This she did, and soon he was healed. A few days later, the old man was again taken sick. Again he told the woman what roots and leaves to gather. She did as she was told, and soon he was well. Many times the old man fell sick. Each time he had a different sickness. Each time he told the woman what plants and herbs to find to cure him. Each time she remembered what she had been told. Soon this woman of the Bear Clan knew more about healing than all the other people. One day, the old man told her that the Great Spirit had sent him to Earth to teach the Indian people the secrets of healing. "I came sick and hungry to many a wigwam door. No blanket was drawn aside for me to pass in. You alone lifted the blanket from your wigwam door and bade me to enter. You are of the Bear Clan. Therefore all the other clans shall come to the Bear Clan for help in sickness. You shall teach all the clans what plants and roots and leaves to gather, that the sick may be healed. And the bear shall be the greatest and strongest of the clans." The Indian woman lifted her face to the Great Spirit to thank him for this great gift and knowledge of healing. When she turned again to the man, he had disappeared. No one was there, but a rabbit was running swiftly down the trail. This is the end of How the Indians Learned to Heal by Mabel Powers. This recording is in the public domain.
Good Things for Breakfast by Olive Hyde Foster. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. For these recipes, unless otherwise specified, make all measurements level. The use of measuring cups divided into halves and thirds is strongly urged, as well as the tea and table measuring spoons. Every mother should begin to instruct her little daughter at an early age in the different branches of housekeeping, and if taught in the right way, none will prove more attractive than cooking. When quite young, the child will be eager to experiment and generally will be careful, and with many of the simple recipes, she can scarcely make a mistake, and they will prove invaluable to her later on. Cooking is of great educational value. Aside from giving a girl that knowledge necessary to the proper conduct of a home, in the dexterous handling of utensils and food products, the concentration required, and the practice of doing certain work for certain results, it also gives excellent mental training and brings all-round development. Every girl should become a good practical cook, and in the majority of cases the mother, for many reasons, is the best teacher. Equipment. The small cook should be provided with her own apron, sleeves, and cap. Also attached to her belt a tea towel and a small holder for lifting hot pans. This will make her feel more important and, 2, impress upon her the need of having everything clean and orderly. Then emphasize the necessity of always following directions and taking the pains to make each cupful an even cupful, each spoonful an even spoonful. The pan for baking should be thoroughly greased and set aside ready for use, after the fire has first been put in good condition, so that the oven will be right, and then all the cooking utensils and materials placed conveniently at hand. For the first lesson, suppose the choice be baking powder biscuit. When properly made, they are delicious, but from the number of times that otherwise good cooks fail on this point, I have come to the conclusion that the secret lies in the mixing and handling. Baking powder biscuit. Have the child place 2 even cupfuls of flour in the sifter with 2 level teaspoonfuls of baking powder, half a teaspoonful of salt, and then sift. To this add 1 rounded tablespoonful of lard. The little maid's hands and nails should be specially cleaned so she can work this thoroughly into the flour, and it may take her 5 minutes to do it properly. Next, dusting her hands, have her take a table fork and stir all the time as she adds the milk. Generally 3/4 of a cupful of milk is enough, but if the flour was packed in solid, it may take a whole cupful. Mix up well with the fork into a soft dough and turn out on a floured breadboard. She must not handle it even now, but sprinkle over just enough flour to keep the rolling pin from sticking while she rolls it out until 3/4 of an inch thick. Next, she should be shown how to cut into small rounds without any waste, for the dough that is left to be molded over will take up more flour and consequently be thicker and not so light. As each biscuit is cut, it should be carefully placed in the pan close to its neighbor, but not crowding, and when all are ready, popped into a hot oven for 15 minutes baking. This lesson should be repeated in a few days before the child has forgotten any of the details, and thereafter it is advisable to let her make the same dough for different purposes at least once a week for a while. For meat pies, dumplings, or shortcake, 1/2 the recipe will be plenty for a family of 4, and she will feel that she has learned each time how to make a new dish. Provide a small blank book and have her write down every recipe with the full directions for mixing. This will be her very own, and as it grows will come to be a valued treasure. Baked apples. As cooked fruits are such nourishing food, let the child prepare some kind while the biscuits are baking. Apples, for instance. The oven being hot, it is best to bake them, so show her how to wash, core, and then fill each opening with sugar, cinnamon, and a little butter. It will take only a few moments to prepare them, and while the baking is in progress, the dishes that have been used should be washed and set in the closet. The materials left be put away. All must be in order before the lesson is pronounced over and the dishpan wiped and put up. Where it is desired to serve the apples and biscuits at the same meal, the apples should be prepared first, as they take longer to bake. Cornbread. Cornbread, too, is easy for any child to make. Have her mix 1 1/2 cups of sifted flour, 1/2 cup of yellow cornmeal, 3 tablespoons of granulated sugar, 1 teaspoon of salt, and 2 teaspoons of baking powder. Add 2 well-beaten eggs, 1 cup milk, and 1 tablespoon of melted butter. Pour in buttered tin or gem pans and bake in hot oven for 15 or 20 minutes. Muffins. Then next try muffins. Have her sift 2 cups of flour, 1 teaspoon of salt, and 2 teaspoons of baking powder. Add 1 cup of milk, 2 tablespoons of melted butter, and 2 eggs, with the stiff whites last. Bake in buttered muffin tins 15 or 20 minutes in a hot oven. Griddle cakes. If successful with these things, she will be quite sure with a little care to make good griddle cakes. Have her sift 2 cups of flour with 2 teaspoons of baking powder, half a teaspoon of salt, a tablespoon of sugar, and stir in the yolks of 2 eggs well beaten and a cup and a half of milk. When perfectly smooth and just before baking, fold in the stiff whites. Grease a hot griddle with a piece of suet, put down a spoonful of batter at a time, and turn as soon as it bubbles well over the top. Watch carefully to keep from burning, but never turn a pancake the second time. After a girl has learned how to make biscuit and other light breads, she should be shown at once how to prepare eggs in different ways so that she will be able at any time to serve a dainty breakfast. Boiled eggs. To boil an egg would seem to be the easiest matter possible, but it requires care just the same. Scarcely any 2 people in a family like eggs cooked the same length of time, and so, after ascertaining the way each one prefers, have the water boiling hard and then check by adding a little cold water so that the shells will not crack from the heat. Put in the eggs carefully with a tablespoon to prevent striking each other. Boil the required number of minutes and remove each when its time is up, sending to the table at once. Hard-boiled eggs, to be digestible, should be kept just at the boiling point for 30 minutes. The yolks will then be mealy. Poached eggs. Poached eggs should be dropped in buttered gem pans and then set in a deep dripping pan and covered with boiling water. When boiled as long as desired, lift gently onto rounds of buttered toast, sprinkle with salt and pepper, garnish with parsley or small celery leaves, and serve on a hot platter. Plain omelet. For an omelet for 4 people, separate yolks and whites of 5 eggs. Beat yolks very light, add 1/4 teaspoonful salt, pepper, 5 tablespoonfuls milk, and lastly the whites, beaten very stiff. Mix lightly but thoroughly and pour in well buttered hot frying pan. Place on stove about 2 minutes until well puffed up, then put in oven for a moment until firm on top. On removing, fold omelet over with a cake turner, place on a hot plate, and garnish with parsley. Fancy omelets. After the little daughter has mastered this popular dish, show her how to make it into a fancy one by adding various things. A small quantity, half a cupful of chopped ham, stirred in before cooking, converts it into a ham omelet. A cupful of cold boiled rice mixed thoroughly through the uncooked eggs. A rice omelet, while a cupful of chopped meat, or better, chopped chicken, will make a meat or chicken omelet. A delicious green corn omelet has the pulp from 2 ears of green corn, grated from the cob, added just before cooking. This should be given a slower fire and more time. For a cheese omelet, sprinkle half a cupful of grated cheese over the eggs after they are cooked before folding over. Omelet garnishing. The wise mother will suggest to the young cook that instead of always using one recipe, she try to think of some way of improving or varying it. A few green peas left from dinner can be made hot and sprinkled over an omelet the same way as the cheese, or the cup of stewed tomatoes left from the day before, strained, thickened with a teaspoonful of flour, seasoned with butter, pepper, and salt, and served as a sauce, this making a delicious accompaniment to a plain omelet. Creamed eggs. Take the desired number of hot, hard-boiled eggs, cut in quarters, lay on pieces of hot buttered toast, and cover with white sauce. This makes a most appetizing dish for breakfast or luncheon. Garnish with parsley. Deviled eggs. Put on in hot water, simmer for half an hour, then place in cold water to loosen shells. When cold, cut in half, remove yolks, mash and season with salt, pepper, a dash of prepared mustard, and a teaspoonful of vinegar, with a half teaspoonful of soft butter for each egg. Rub to a smooth paste and pack back in the whites. For picnics, fasten 2 halves together with a wooden toothpick. Scrambled eggs. Beat the desired number enough to break the yolks, season with salt and pepper, and add a tablespoonful of milk for each egg. Put in a hot pan half a teaspoonful of butter for each egg, and when melted, pour in the beaten eggs. Stir constantly, scraping from the bottom of the pan until cooked enough to suit individual taste, but watch closely, for the longer they cook, the drier they become. Garnish with parsley or with dried beef frizzled in a hot skillet with a small quantity of butter. Bacon and eggs. Place thin slices of bacon in a hot skillet, turn frequently to keep from curling, and remove to a hot plate when cooked as much as desired. Break eggs in a saucer one at a time to see that they are fresh, then drop gently into the hot fat. When done to suit individual taste, lift carefully to the center of a hot platter and garnish with the bacon. The secret of an attractive table, which should be made clear to every girl, is clean linen with dishes and silver carefully arranged. Each article of food, however simple, should be carefully placed in the center of its dish, and vegetables, meats, and salads garnished with parsley, celery leaves, or occasionally rings of hard-boiled eggs. The eggs are especially nice on salads and on such a vegetable as spinach. A kitchen lesson would be incomplete without a few words regarding the care of the all-important dish towels and dishcloth. However many may be on hand, it is a wise plan to teach the little cook to take warm water and plenty of soap and wash them out each time, being careful to rinse them thoroughly after she is through, then hang out in the air to dry. End of Good Things for Breakfast by Olive Hyde Foster.
The Princess Nobody, A Tale of Fairyland by Andrew Lang, after the drawings by Richard Doyle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ballad of Dedication. To all you babes at Branksome Park, this book I dedicate, a book for winter evenings dark to ride or skate. I made it up out of my pate, and wasted midnight oil, interpreting each cut and plate, the works of Dicky Doyle. When weary winter comes, and hark, the Teviot roars in spate, when half you think you'll need the ark, the floods so fierce and great. Think of the prince, and of his mate, their triumph and their toil, and mark them drawn, in all their state, the works of Dicky Doyle. Now, if my nonsense hits the mark, if Winnie, Pop, and Kate think tales of fays and giants stark, not wholly out of date, another time perchance I'll prate, and keep a merry coil, though ne'er I'll match the drawings great, the works of Dicky Doyle. And boy, girls, may you ne'er know fear nor hate, boys, feel like Mr. Royal, and please don't say I desecrate the works of Dicky Doyle. Chapter 1. The Princess Nobody. Once upon a time, when fairies were much more common than they are now, there lived a king and a queen. Their country was close to Fairyland, and very often the little elves would cross over the border and come into the king's fields and gardens. The girl fairies would swing out of the bells of the fuchsias, and loll on the leaves, and drink the little drops of dew that fell down the stems. Here you may see all the fairies making themselves merry at a picnic on a fuchsia, and an ugly little dwarf is climbing up the stalk. Now the king and queen of the country next to Fairyland were very rich, and very fond of each other, but one thing made them unhappy. They had no child, neither boy nor girl, to sit on the throne when they were dead and gone. Often the queen said she wished she had a child, even if it were no bigger than her thumb, and she hoped the fairies might hear her and help her, but they never took any notice. One day, when the king had been counting out his money all day, the day when the tributes were paid in, he grew very tired. He took off his crown and went into the garden. Then he looked all round his kingdom, and said, "Ah, I would give it all for a baby." No sooner had the king said this, than he heard a little squeaking voice near his foot. "You shall have a lovely baby, if you will give me what I ask." The king looked down, and there was the funniest little dwarf that ever was seen. He had a high red cap like a flower. He had a big mustache and a short beard that curled outwards. His cloak was red like his cap, and his coat was green, and he rode on a green frog. Many people would have been frightened, but the king was used to fairies. "You shall have a beautiful baby if you will give me what I ask," said the dwarf again. "I'll give you anything you like," said the king. "Then promise to give me Nianti," said the dwarf. "Certainly," said the king, who had not an idea what Nianti meant. "How will you take it?" "I will take it," said the dwarf, "in my own way, on my own day." With that he set spurs to his frog, which cleared the garden path at one bound, and he was soon lost among the flowers. Well, next day a dreadful war broke out between the ghosts and the giants, and the king had to set forth and fight on the side of his friends the giants. A long, long time he was away, nearly a year. At last he came back to his own country, and he heard all the church bells ringing merrily. "What can be the matter?" said the king, and hurried to his palace, where all the courtiers rushed out and told him the queen had got a baby. "Girl or boy?" says the king. "A princess, your majesty," says the nurse, with a low curtsy, correcting him. Well, you may fancy how glad the king was, though he would have preferred a boy. "What have you called her?" he asked. "Till your majesty's return we thought it better not to christen the princess," said the nurse, "so we have called her by the Italian name for nothing, Nianti. The Princess Nianti, your majesty." When the king heard that, he remembered that he had promised to give Nianti to the dwarf. He hid his face in his hands and groaned. Nobody knew what he meant, or why he was sad, so he thought it best to keep it to himself. He went in and kissed the queen, and comforted her, and looked at the baby. Never was there a baby so beautiful. She was like a fairy's child, and so light. She could sit on a flower and not crush it. She had little wings on her back, and all the birds were fond of her. The peasants and common people, who said they could not see why the first royal baby should be called Nianti, always spoke of her as the Princess Nobody. Only the courtiers called her Nianti. The water fairy was her godmother, but, for a fairy reason, they concealed her real name, and of course she was not christened Nianti. Here you may see her sitting teaching the little birds to sing. They are all round her in a circle, each of them singing his very best. Great fun she and all her little companions had with the birds. Here they are riding on them, and tumbling off when the bird kicks. And here again you may observe the baby princess riding a parrot, while one of her maids of honor teases an owl. Never was there such a happy country, all birds and babies playing together, singing, and as merry as the day was long. Well, this joyful life went on, till the Princess Nianti was growing quite a big girl. She was nearly 14. Then one day came a tremendous knock at the palace gates. Out rushed the porter and saw a little dwarf in a red cap and a red cloak, riding a green frog. "Tell the king he is wanted," said the dwarf. The porter carried this rude message, and the king went trembling to the door. "I have come to claim your promise. You give me Nianti," said the dwarf, in his froggy voice. Now the king had spoken long ago about his foolish promise to the queen of the water fairies, a very powerful person and godmother of his child. "The dwarf must be one of my people if he rides a frog," the queen of the water fairies had said. "Just send him to me if he is troublesome." The king remembered this when he saw the dwarf, so he put a bold face on it. "That's you, is it?" said the king to the dwarf. "Just you go to the queen of the water fairies, and she will have a word to say to you." When the dwarf heard that, it was his turn to tremble. He shook his little fist at the king. He half drew his sword. "I'll have Nianty yet," he said, and he set spurs to his frog and bounded off to see the queen of the water fairies. It was night by the time the dwarf reached the stream where the queen lived, among the long flags and rushes and reeds of the river. Here you see him by the river. How tired his frog looks! He is talking to the water fairy. Well, he and the water fairy had a long talk, and the end of it was that the fairy found only one way of saving the princess. She flew to the king and said, "I can only help you by making the princess vanish clean away. I have a bird here on whose back she can fly away in safety. The dwarf will not get her, but you will never see her again, unless a brave prince can find her where she is hidden and guarded by my water fairies." Then the poor mother and father cried dreadfully, but they saw there was no hope. It was better that the princess should vanish away than that she should be married to a horrid, rude dwarf who rode on a frog. So they sent for the princess and kissed her and embraced her and wept over her, and gradually she faded out of their very arms and vanished clean away. Then she flew away on the bird's back. Chapter 2. In Mushroomland. Now all the kingdom next Fairyland was miserable, and all the people were murmuring, and the king and queen were nearly melted in tears. They thought of all ways to recover their dear daughter, and at last the queen hit on a plan. "My dear," she said to the king, "let us offer to give our daughter for a wife to any prince who will only find her and bring her home." "Who will want to marry a girl he can't see?" said the king. "If they have not married pretty girls they can see, they won't care for poor Nianty." "Never mind, we can only try," said the queen. So she sent out messengers into all the world, and sent the picture of the princess everywhere, and proclaimed that the beautiful Princess Nianty, and no less than 3/4 of the kingdom, would be given to the prince that could find the princess and bring her home. And there was to be a great tournament or sham fight at the palace to amuse all the princes before they went on the search. So many princes gathered together, all full of hope, and they rode against each other with spears and swords, and knocked each other about, and afterwards dined and danced and made merry. Some fairy knights too came over the border, and they fought with spears, riding beetles and grasshoppers instead of horses. Here's a picture of a joust or tournament between 2 sets of fairy knights. By all these warlike exercises they increased their courage till they felt brave enough to fight all the ghosts and all the giants if only they could save the beautiful princess. Well, the tournaments were over, and off all the princes went into Fairyland. What funny sights they saw in Fairyland! They saw a great snail race, the snails running so fast that some of the fairy jockeys fell off on the grass. They saw a fairy boy dancing with a squirrel, and they found all the birds and all the beasts quite friendly and kind, and able to talk like other people. This was the way in old times, but now no beasts talk, and no birds except parrots only. Now among all this gallant army of princes, one was ugly, and he looked old and odd, and the rest laughed at him and called him the Prince Comical. But he had a kind heart. One day, when he was out walking alone and thinking what he could do to find the princess, he saw 3 bad little boys teasing a big daddy-long-legs. They had got a hold of one of his legs and were pulling at it with all their might. When the Prince Comical saw this, he ran up and drove the bad boys away, and rubbed the limb of the daddy-long-legs, till he gave up groaning and crying. Then the daddy-long-legs sat up and said in a weak voice, "You have been very kind to me. What can I do for you?" "Oh, help me," said the prince, "to find the Princess Niente. You fly everywhere. Don't you know where she is?" "I don't know," said the daddy-long-legs mournfully. "I have never flown so far, but I know that you are all in a very dangerous part of Fairyland, and I will take you to an aged black beetle who can give you the best advice." So saying, the daddy-long-legs walked off with the prince till they came to the black beetle. "Can you tell the prince," said the daddy-long-legs, "where the Princess Niente is hidden?" "I know it is in Mushroomland," said the beetle, "but he will want a guide." "Will you be my guide?" asked the prince. "Yes," said the beetle, "but what about your friends, the other princes?" "Oh, they must come too. It would not be fair to leave them behind," said the Prince Comical. He was the soul of honor, and though the others laughed at him, he would not take advantage of his luck and run away from them. "Well, you are a true knight," said the black beetle, "but before we go into the depths of Mushroomland, just you come here with me." Then the black beetle pointed out to the prince a great, smooth, round, red thing a long way off. "That is the first mushroom in Mushroomland," said the beetle. "Now come with me, and you shall see what you shall see." So the prince followed the beetle till they came to the mushroom. "Climb up and look over," said the beetle. So the prince climbed up and looked over, and there he saw a crowned king, sound asleep. "Here is the Prince Comical. You see he is not very handsome, and here is the king, so sound asleep." "Try to waken him," said the beetle. "Just try." So the prince tried to waken the king, but it was of no use. "Now take warning by that," said the black beetle, "and never go to sleep under a mushroom in Mushroom Country. You will never wake, if you do, till the Princess Niente is found again." Well, the Prince Comical said he would remember that, and he and the beetle went off and found the other princes. They were disposed to laugh at being led by a black beetle, but one of them, who was very learned, reminded them that armies had been led before by woodpeckers and wolves and hummingbirds. So they all moved on, and at night they were very tired. Now there was no houses and not many trees in Mushroomland, and when night came all the princes wanted to lie down under a very big mushroom. It was in vain that the black beetle and Prince Comical warned them to beware. As they marched through Mushroomland, the twilight came upon them, and the elves began to come out for their dance, for elves only dance at dusk, and they could not help joining them, which was very imprudent, as they had plenty to do the next day, and it would have been wiser if they had gone to sleep. The elves went on with their play till midnight, and exactly at midnight the elves stopped their play and undressed and got up into the boughs of a big tree and went to sleep. You may wonder how the elves know when it is midnight, as there are no clocks in Mushroomland, of course. But they cannot really help knowing. It is exactly at 12 that the mushrooms begin to grow, and the little mushrooms came up. Now the elves covered every branch of the tree, as you can see in the picture, and the fairies did not know where to lie down. At last they decided to lie under a very big mushroom. "Nonsense," they said. "You may sleep out in the open air if you like. We mean to make ourselves comfortable here." So they all lay down under the shelter of the mushroom, and Prince Comical slept in the open air. In the morning he awakened, feeling very well and hungry, and off he set to call his friends. but he might as well have called the mushroom itself. There they all lay under its shade, and though some of them had their eyes open, not one of them could move. The prince shook them, dragged them, shouted at them, and pulled their hair. But the more he shouted and dragged, the louder they snored. And the worst of it was that he could not pull them out of the shadow of the magic mushroom. So there he had to leave them sound asleep. The prince thought the elves could help him perhaps, so he went and asked them how to waken his friends. They were all awake, and the fairies were dressing the baby elves, but they only said, "Oh, it's their fault for sleeping under a mushroom. Anybody would know that is a stupid thing to do. Besides, we have no time to attend to them, as the sun will be up soon, and we must get these babies dressed and be off before then." "Why, where are you going to?" said the prince. "Ah, nobody knows where we go to in the daytime," said the elves, and nobody does. "Well, what am I to do now?" said the prince to the black beetle. "I don't know where the princess is," said the beetle, "but the bluebird is very wise, and he may know. Now your best plan will be to steal 2 of the bluebird's eggs, and not give them back till he tells you all he can." So off they set for the bluebird's nest, and to make a long story short, the prince stole 2 of the eggs, and would not give them back till the bird promised to tell him all it knew. And the end of it was that the bird carried him to the court of the Queen of Mushroomland. She was sitting in her crown on a mushroom, and she looked very funny and mischievous. Here you see the prince with his hat off kissing the queen's hair and asking for the princess. "Oh, she's quite safe," said the Queen of Mushroomland. "But what a funny boy you are! You are not half handsome enough for the princess. Niente?" The poor prince blushed. "They call me Prince Comical," said he. "I know I'm not half good enough." "Oh, you are good enough for anything," said the Queen of Mushroomland, "but you might be prettier." Then she touched him with her wand, and he became as handsome a prince as ever was seen, in a beautiful red silk doublet, slashed with white, and a long gold-colored robe. "Now you will do for my Princess Niente," said the Queen of Mushroomland. "Bluebird," and she whispered in the bluebird's ear, "take him away to the Princess Niente." So they flew, and they flew, all day and all night, and next day they came to a green bower, all full of fairies and butterflies and funny little people, and there, with all her long yellow hair round her, there sat the Princess Niente, and the Prince Charming laid his crown at her feet and knelt on one knee and asked the princess to be his love and his lady. And she did not refuse him, so they were married in the church of the elves, and the glowworm sent his torches, and all the bells of all the flowers made a merry peal, and soon they were to travel home to the king and the queen. Chapter 3. Lost and Found. Now the prince had found the princess, and you might think that they had nothing to do but go home again. The father and mother of the princess were wearying very much to hear about her. Every day they climbed to the bartizan of the castle and looked across the plain, hoping to see dust on the road and some brave prince riding back with their daughter. But she never came, and their hair grew gray with sorrow and time. The parents of other princes, too, who were all asleep under the mushroom, were alarmed about their sons and feared that they had all been taken prisoners, or perhaps eaten up by some giant. But Princess Niente and Prince Charming were lingering in the enchanted land, too happy to leave the flowers, the brooks, and the fairies. The faithful black beetle often whispered to the prince that it was time to turn homewards, but the prince paid no more attention to his ally than if he had been an earwig. So there, in the Valley Magical, the prince and the princess might be wandering to this day, but for a very sad accident. The night they were married, the princess had said to the prince, "Now you may call me Nianti, or any pet name you like, but never call me by my own name." "But I don't know it," said the prince. "Do tell me what it is." "Never," said the princess. "You must never seek to know it." "Why not?" said the prince. "Something dreadful will happen," said the princess, "if ever you find out my name and call me by it." And she looked quite as if she could be very angry. Now ever after this, the prince kept wondering what his wife's real name could be, till he made himself quite unhappy. "Is it Margaret?" he would say, when he thought the princess was off her guard. Or, "Is it Joan? Is it Dorothy? It can't be Sybil, can it?" But she would never tell him. Now one morning the princess woke very early, but she felt so happy that she could not sleep. She lay awake and listened to the birds singing, and then she watched a fairy boy teasing a bird, which sang, so the boy said, out of tune, and another fairy baby riding on a fly. At last the princess, who thought the prince was sound asleep, began to croon softly a little song she had made about him and her. She had never told him about the song, partly because she was shy and partly for another reason. So she crooned and hummed to herself. "Oh, hand in hand with Gwendoline, while yet our locks are gold, he'll fare among the forests green, and through the gardens old. And when like leaves that lose their green, our gold has turned to grey, then hand in hand with Gwendoline, he'll fade and pass away." "Oh, Gwendoline is your name, is it?" said the prince, who had been wide awake and listening to her song. And he began to laugh at having found out her secret, and tried to kiss her. But the princess turned very, very cold and white like marble, so that the prince began to shiver, and he sat down on a fallen mushroom and hid his face in his hands, and in a moment all his beautiful hair vanished, and his splendid clothes, and his gold train, and his crown. He wore a red cap and common clothes, and was Prince Comical once more. But the princess arose, and she vanished swiftly away. Opposite you see the poor prince crying and the princess vanishing away. Thus he was punished for being curious and prying. It is natural, you will say, that a man should like to call his wife by her name, but the fairies would not allow it, and, what is more, there are still some nations who will not allow a woman to mention the name of her husband. Well, here was a sad state of things. The princess was lost as much as ever, and Prince Charming was changed back into Prince Comical. The black beetle sighed day and night, and mingled his tears with those of the prince, but neither of them knew what to do. They wandered about the Valley Magical, and though it was just as pretty as ever, it seemed quite ugly and stupid to them. The worst of it was that the prince felt so foolish. After winning the greatest good fortune and the dearest bride in the world, he had thrown everything away. He walked about crying, "Oh, oh, Nianti, dear Nianti, return to your own Prince Comical, and all will be forgiven." It is impossible to say what would have happened, and probably the prince would have died of sorrow and hunger, for he ate nothing, if the black beetle had not one day met a bat, which was the favorite charger of Puck. Now Puck, as all the world knows, is the jester at the court of Fairyland. He can make Oberon and Titania, the king and queen, laugh at the tricks he plays, and therefore they love him so much that there is nothing they would not do for him. So the black beetle began to talk about his master, the prince, to the bat Puck commonly rode. and the bat, a good-natured creature, told the whole story to Puck. Now Puck was also in a good humor, so he jumped at once on his bat's back and rode off to consult the king and queen of Fairyland. Well, they were sorry for the prince. He had only broken one little fairy law after all, and they sent Puck back to tell him what he was to do. This was to find the bluebird again and get the bluebird to guide him to the home of the water fairy, the godmother of the princess. Long and far the prince wandered, but at last he found the bluebird once more, and the bird, very good-naturedly, promised to fly in front of him till he led him to the beautiful stream where the water fairy held her court. So they reached it at last, and then the bluebird harnessed himself to the chariot of the water fairy, and the chariot was the white cup of the water lily. When he pulled and pulled at the chariot, here he is dragging along the water fairy, till he brought her where the prince was waiting. At first, when she saw him, she was rather angry. "Why did you find out my goddaughter's name?" she said. And the prince had no excuse to make. He only turned red and sighed. This rather pleased the water fairy. "Do you love the princess very much?" said she. "Oh, more than all the world," said the prince. "Then back you go to Mushroomland, and you will find her in the old place. But perhaps she will not be pleased to forgive you at first." The prince thought he would chance that, but he did not say so. He only bowed very low and thanked the water fairy. Then off he set, with the bluebird to guide him, in search of Mushroomland. At long and at last he reached it, and glad he was to see the little sentinel on the border of the country. All up and down Mushroomland the prince searched, and at last he saw his own princess, and he rushed up and knelt at her feet, and held out his hand to ask pardon for having disobeyed the fairy law. But she was still rather cross, and down she jumped, and ran round the mushroom, and he ran after her. So he chased her for a minute or two, and at last she laughed and popped up her head over the mushroom and pursed up her lips into a cherry. And he kissed her across the mushroom and knew he had won back his own dear princess, and they felt even happier than if they had never been parted. Journeys end in lovers' meeting, and so do stories. The prince has his princess once again, and I can tell you they did not wait long this time in the Valley of Magical. Off they went straight home, and the black beetle guided them, flying in a bee-line. Just on the further border of Mushroomland, they came to all the princes fast asleep. But when the princess drew near, they all wakened and jumped up, and they slapped the fortunate prince on the back, and wished him luck, and cried, "Hello, comical old chap! We hardly knew you. Why, you've grown quite handsome." And so he had. He was changed into Prince Charming again, but he was so happy he never noticed it, for he was not conceited. But the princess noticed it, and she loved him all the better. Then they all made a procession, with the black beetle marching at the head. Indeed, they called him Black Rod now, and he was quite a courtier. So, with flags flying and music playing, they returned to the home of the princess, and the king and queen met them at the park gates, and fell on the neck of the prince and princess, and kissed them, and laughed and cried for joy, and kissed them again. You may be sure the old nurse was among the foremost, her face quite shining with pleasure, and using longer words than the noblest there. And she admired the prince very much, and was delighted that her girl, as she called the princess, had got such a good husband. So here we leave them, and that country remained always happy, and so it has neither history nor geography, Therefore you won't find it on any map, nor can you read about it in any book but this book. Lastly, there is a picture of the prince and princess at home, sitting on a beautiful rose, as a fairy's godchild can do if she pleases. As to the black beetle, he was appointed to a place about the court, but he never married. He had no children, and there were no other black beetles, consequently, in the country where the prince and princess became king and queen. Au temps jadis, as Perrault says, in half-forgotten fairy days, there lived a king once and a queen, as few there are, as more have been. Ah, still we love the well-worn phrase, still love to tread the ancient ways, to break the fence, to thread the maze, to see the beauty we have seen, au temps jadis. Here's luck to every child that strays in Fairyland among the frays, that follows through the forest green, Prince Comical and Gwendoline, that reads the tales we used to praise, au temps jadis. End of The Princess Nobody, a Tale of Fairyland by Andrew Lang, after the drawings by Richard Doyle.
The Roosevelt Bears Arrive in London by Seymour Eaton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Roosevelt Bears Arrive in London. We've reached a very giddy height, said Teddy B quite late that night, in Windsor Castle where they slept, in a room a valet said was kept for kings and queens, for royalty of this foremost rank and high degree. For don't you know, this valet said, that in this room and in this bed slept Charles the First, who lost his head, and John and James and Henry VIII, and George the Third, whom Yankees hate, and foreign kings and queens a score, who came as guests to England's shores. It makes me nervous, said Teddy G, to think of the things that might happen me, if I should wake tonight in bed and find myself without a head, or if tomorrow when you ring you found me turned into a king. Then what would happen, tell me, Bob, with two kings working on the job? But they slept all night in this royal bed with its curtain canopy overhead. And at 9 a.m. on the following day, Teddy G poked out his head to say to the valet who had pressed their suits and brushed their hats and shined their boots, please close the door, I didn't ring, for another hour let me be king. And said Teddy B, this place suits me, I slept like a prince and feel like three. As they left for London at noon that day, they thanked the king for the royal way he had entertained, and this said they, if you'll visit us in the USA, when we get back to our home again, and stop with us in our mountain den, we'll give you food and naught to do, and let you sleep all winter through, and dream of castles and suck your paw, it beats all the kingdoms you ever saw. The king just laughed as the train pulled out, but he said to himself as he turned about, it would help me carry my country's cares if every home had teddy bears. We're off to London, said Teddy B, and all of London I want to see, its famous bridge with the Thames beneath, and Charing Cross and Hampstead Heath, and the London Tower with its massive keys, and I'd like to see old Cheshire cheese, and eat beefsteak pudding piping hot in the very chair on the very spot where Dr. Samuel Johnson sat while Boswell listened to his chat. And Whittington I'd like to see, and his famous cat and kittens 3. Never mind the kittens, said Teddy G, the thing you named that pleases me is that beefsteak pudding piping hot, served with onions in a pot. Let's go there first and get it down, and then go out to see the town. And thus they talked as on they went to London town on pleasure bent, but where they went and what they did would fill 10 books from lid to lid. They walked right into the London swim, and saw the town from hub to rim, and made the old place whirl and creak each day and night for about a week. They scattered money left and right, and stayed up till morning every night. We'll order suits, said Teddy B, from the tailor to his majesty. A lot of clothes the king must wear, for one sees this tailor everywhere. If he does us up in London style, Pall Mall will laugh and Bond Street smile, for we'll cut a swath where'er we go, as swell and wide as Rotten Row. The order given, 2 suits were made, which put Fifth Avenue in the shade. They went one day for a rambling walk, to view the town and to have a talk. With boys they met on street and square, about things they noticed, here and there. Said Teddy G to a horseman guard, as he gave his name without a card, "Good sir, get down, give me your suit, from head to toe, from cap to boot. With Teddy B you stay right here, and let me be a grenadier." The guard obeyed to see the fun, for he knew his horse would enjoy a run. And run he did around a square, with Teddy G high up in air, on neck and tail and upside down, and backwards too, like circus clown. The House of Lords and Commons too had an hour's recess to see him do the cowboy ride as grenadier, and applauded loud with cheer on cheer. That very day they lost their way, and lost their guide, who lost his pay, and lost the sun and lost its light, in a London fog as black as night. They lost the stores and hansom cabs, and men they bumped and gave them jabs, and some they scared from head to feet, to meet 2 bears on the public street. They lost their hats, and Teddy B his glasses lost and couldn't see, but he saw as well as any bear, for darkness filled in everywhere. The things they saw were shadows black, with lights like ghosts across their track. Which way to turn or where they go, or what to do, they didn't know. The things they heard were whistles loud, for cabs and hansoms for the crowd. But the whistles came and the calls rang out, from overhead and all about, in such a tangle, twist and mix, that all were in the self-same fix. Teddy G said he would find the street, if he had to crawl on hands and feet, and try he did, but he couldn't see, and he lost himself and Teddy B. The last thing heard from him that day, as he rambled off in the fog to stay, was a whistle shrill, then a record shout, to get Sherlock Holmes to help him out. End of The Bears Arrive in London by Seymour Eaton. Read by Betty B.
The Discontented Stonecutter, adapted from the Japanese, from Journey Through Bookland by Charles H. Sylvester. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Wayne Cook. Once upon a time there was a man who worked from early morning till late at night cutting building stones out of the solid rock. His pay was small and hardly enough to keep his wife and children from starving, so the poor stonecutter grew discontented and sighed and moaned bitterly over his hard lot. One day, when his work seemed harder than usual and his troubles more than he could bear, he cried out in despair, "Oh, I wish I could be rich and lie at ease on a soft couch with a curtain of red silk." Just then a beautiful fairy floated down from heaven and softly said, "Thy wish is granted thee." So the poor stonecutter found himself rich and powerful and resting easily on his silken couch with its red curtain. As he gazed out, however, he saw the king of the country ride by with many horsemen before and behind him, and with a great golden sunshade held over his head. It irritated the rich man to have no parasol over his head, and to see another more powerful than himself, and in his discontentment he exclaimed, "Would that I were a king such as that one." Once again his good fairy appeared, waved his wand, and said, "It shall be as thou desirest." Immediately the man was king, and before him and behind him rode his men-at-arms, and over his head was a golden sunshade. But elsewhere the sun shone fiercely down and dried up the vegetation with its terrible heat, It was reflected into the face of the king so that even the golden sunshade did not keep him from suffering. Once more he sighed discontentedly, "If I could only be the sun." Almost before he spoke, he found himself to be the sun, and he began joyously to send his fiery rays above, below, and everywhere round about him. He scorched the grass of the earth, and burned the faces of its rulers, and felt his power unlimited, until a little cloud placed itself between him and the earth, and threw back his scorching rays. It still angered him to find something more powerful than himself, and he wished aloud that he might be the cloud. Again his wish was granted, and he found himself floating where he wished through the sky. He ran between the sun and the earth, and sheltered the latter so that the grass grew green, the trees leaved out again, and everything rejoiced in a new growth. Then he set great floods of rain upon the earth, filled the rivers till they overflowed, swept homes and herds into the sea, and destroyed the works of man in every direction. But try as he would, he could not move one great rock that stood right across his way, though he sent waters that roared around its base and pushed hard against it, yet it remained immovable. Such a failure angered the man-cloud, and again he cried out, "Would that I were a rock, so strong and immovable is it." This time also his guardian angel interfered, and he found himself a rock that withstood the sun, the wind, and the waters. But then, one day, there came along a rude stonecutter, who, with chisel and heavy hammer, began to cut the great rock into small, regular building stones. "What does this mean?" cried the rock. "Has this man power to cut me in pieces? Surely I am weaker than he. Would I were a stonecutter." "As thou wishest, so shall it be," said his guardian angel, and immediately he was again a stonecutter, working hard as before and for small wages, but happy and content with his lot. End of The Discontented Stonecutter, adapted from the Japanese, from Journeys Through Bookland by Charles H. Sylvester.
The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. High above the city, on a tall column, stood the statue of the Happy Prince. He was gilded all over with thin leaves of fine gold. For eyes he had 2 bright sapphires, and a large red ruby glowed on his sword hilt. He was very much admired indeed. "He is as beautiful as a weathercock," remarked one of the town councillors, who wished to gain a reputation for having artistic tastes. "Only not quite so useful," he added, fearing lest people should think him unpractical, which he really was not. "Why can't you be like the Happy Prince?" asked a sensible mother of her little boy who was crying for the moon. "The Happy Prince never dreams of crying for anything." "I am glad there is someone in the world who is quite happy," muttered a disappointed man as he gazed at the wonderful statue. "He looks just like an angel," said the charity children as they came out of the cathedral in their bright scarlet cloaks and their clean white pinafores. "How do you know?" said the mathematical master. "You have never seen one." "Ah, but we have, in our dreams," answered the children, and the mathematical master frowned and looked very severe, for he did not approve of children dreaming. One night there flew over the city a little swallow. His friends had gone away to Egypt 6 weeks before, but he had stayed behind, for he was in love with the most beautiful reed. He had met her early in the spring as he was flying down the river after a big yellow moth, and had been so attracted by her slender waist that he had stopped to talk to her. "Shall I love you?" said the swallow, who liked to come to the point at once, and the reed made him a low bow. So he flew round and round her, touching the water with his wings and making silver ripples. This was his courtship, and it lasted all through the summer. "It is a ridiculous attachment," twittered the other swallows. "She has no money, and far too many relations." And indeed the river was quite full of reeds. Then, when the autumn came, they all flew away. After they had gone, he felt lonely, and began to tire of his lady-love. "She has no conversation," he said, "and I am afraid that she is a coquette, for she is always flirting with the wind." And certainly, whenever the wind blew, the reed made the most graceful curtsies. "I admit that she is domestic," he continued, "but I love travelling, and my wife, consequently, should love travelling also. Will you come away with me?" he said finally to her, but the reed shook her head. She was so attached to her home. "You have been trifling with me," he cried. "I am off to the pyramids. Goodbye." And he flew away. All day long he flew, and at night-time he arrived at the city. "Where shall I put up?" he said. "I hope the town has made preparations." Then he saw the statue on the tall column. "I will put up there," he cried. "It is a fine position, with plenty of fresh air." So he alighted just between the feet of the happy prince. "I have a golden bedroom," he said softly to himself as he looked round, and he prepared to go to sleep. But just as he was putting his head under his wing, a large drop of water fell on him. "What a curious thing!" he cried. "There is not a single cloud in the sky. The stars are quite clear and bright, and yet it is raining. The climate in the north of Europe is really dreadful. The reed used to like the rain, but that was merely her selfishness." Then another drop fell. "What is the use of a statue if it cannot keep the rain off?" he said. "I must look for a good chimney-pot," and he determined to fly away. But before he had opened his wings, a third drop fell, and he looked up and saw... what did he see? The eyes of the happy prince were filled with tears, and tears were running down his golden cheeks. His face was so beautiful in the moonlight that the little swallow was filled with pity. "Who are you?" he said. "I am the happy prince." "Why are you weeping, then?" asked the swallow. "You have quite drenched me." "When I was alive and had a human heart," answered the statue, "I did not know what tears were, for I lived in the palace of Sans Souci, where sorrow is not allowed to enter. In the daytime I played with my companions in the garden, and in the evening I led the dance in the great hall. Round the garden ran a very lofty wall, but I never cared to ask what lay beyond it. Everything about me was so beautiful. My courtiers called me the happy prince, and happy indeed I was, if pleasure be happiness. So I lived, and so I died. And now that I am dead, they have set me up here so high that I can see all the ugliness and all the misery of my city. And though my heart is made of lead, yet I cannot choose but weep." "What, is he not solid gold?" said the swallow to himself. He was too polite to make any personal remarks out loud. "Far away," continued the statue in a low, musical voice, "far away in a little street there is a poor house. One of the windows is open, and through it I can see a woman seated at a table. Her face is thin and worn, and she has coarse red hands, all pricked by the needle, for she is a seamstress. She is embroidering passion flowers on a satin gown for the loveliest of the Queen's maids of honour to wear at the next court ball. In a bed in the corner of the room her little boy is lying ill. He has a fever and is asking for oranges. His mother has nothing to give him but river water, so he is crying. Swallow, swallow, little swallow, will you not bring her the ruby out of my sword hilt? My feet are fastened to this pedestal, and I cannot move." "I am waited for in Egypt," said the swallow. "My friends are flying up and down the Nile and talking to the large lotus flowers. Soon they will go to sleep in the tomb of the great king. The king is there himself in his painted coffin. He is wrapped in yellow linen and embalmed with spices. Round his neck is a chain of pale green jade, and his hands are like withered leaves." "Swallow, swallow, little swallow," said the prince, "will you not stay with me for one night and be my messenger? The boy is so thirsty, and the mother so sad." "I don't think I like boys," answered the swallow. "Last summer, when I was staying on the river, there were 2 rude boys, the miller's sons, who were always throwing stones at me. They never hit me, of course. We swallows fly far too well for that, and besides, I come of a family famous for its agility, but still, it was a mark of disrespect." But the happy prince looked so sad that the little swallow was sorry. "It is very cold here," he said, "but I will stay with you for one night and be your messenger." "Thank you, little swallow," said the prince. So the swallow picked out the great ruby from the prince's sword and flew away with it in his beak over the roofs of the town. He passed by the cathedral tower, where the white marble angels were sculptured. He passed by the palace and heard the sound of dancing. A beautiful girl came out on the balcony with her lover. "How wonderful the stars are," he said to her, "and how wonderful is the power of love." "I hope my dress will be ready in time for the state ball," she answered. "I have ordered passion flowers to be embroidered on it, but the seamstresses are so lazy." He passed over the river and saw the lanterns hanging to the masts of the ships. He passed over the ghetto and saw the old Jews bargaining with each other and weighing out money in copper scales. At last he came to the poorhouse and looked in. The boy was tossing feverishly on his bed, and the mother had fallen asleep, she was so tired. In he hopped and laid the great ruby on the table beside the woman's thimble. Then he flew gently round the bed, fanning the boy's forehead with his wings. "How cool I feel," said the boy. "I must be getting better." And he sank into a delicious slumber. Then the swallow flew back to the happy prince and told him what he had done. "It is curious," he remarked, "but I feel quite warm now, although it is so cold." "That is because you have done a good action," said the prince, and the little swallow began to think, and then he fell asleep. Thinking always made him sleepy. When day broke, he flew down to the river and had a bath. "What a remarkable phenomenon," said the professor of ornithology as he was passing over the bridge. "A swallow in winter." And he wrote a long letter about it to the local newspaper. Everyone quoted it. It was full of so many words that they could not understand. "Tonight I go to Egypt," said the swallow, and he was in high spirits at the prospect. He visited all the public monuments and sat a long time on top of the church steeple. Wherever he went, the sparrows chirruped and said to each other, "What a distinguished stranger!" So he enjoyed himself very much. When the moon rose, he flew back to the happy prince. "Have you any commissions for Egypt?" he cried. "I am just starting." "Swallow, swallow, little swallow," said the prince, "will you not stay with me one night longer?" "I am waited for in Egypt," answered the swallow. "Tomorrow my friends will fly up to the second cataract. The river horse couches there among the bulrushes, and on a great granite throne sits the god Memnon. All night long he watches the stars, and when the morning star shines, he utters one cry of joy, and then he is silent. At noon the yellow lions come down to the water's edge to drink. They have eyes like green beryls, and their roar is louder than the roar of the cataract." "Swallow, swallow, little swallow," said the prince. "Far away, across the city, I see a young man in a garret. He is leaning over a desk covered with papers, and in a tumbler by his side there is a bunch of withered violets. His hair is brown and crisp, and his lips are red as a pomegranate, and he has large and dreamy eyes. He is trying to finish a play for the director of the theatre, but he is too cold to write any more. There is no fire in the grate, and hunger has made him faint." "I will wait with you 1 night longer," said the Swallow, who really had a good heart. "Shall I take him another ruby?" "Alas, I have no ruby now," said the Prince. "My eyes are all that I have left. They are made of rare sapphires, which were brought out of India 1,000 years ago. Pluck out one of them and take it to him. He will sell it to the jeweller and buy food and firewood and finish his play." "Dear Prince," said the Swallow, "I cannot do that," and he began to weep. "Swallow, swallow, little swallow," said the Prince, "do as I command you." So the Swallow plucked out the Prince's eye and flew away to the student's garret. It was easy enough to get in, as there was a hole in the roof. Through this he darted, and came into the room. The young man had his head buried in his hands, so he did not hear the flutter of the bird's wings, and when he looked up he found the beautiful sapphire lying on the withered violets. "I am beginning to be appreciated," he cried. "This is from some great admirer. Now I can finish my play." And he looked quite happy. The next day the Swallow flew down to the harbour. He sat on the mast of a large vessel and watched the sailors hauling big chests out of the hold with ropes. "Heave ahoy!" they shouted as each chest came up. "I am going to Egypt!" cried the Swallow, but nobody minded, and when the moon rose he flew back to the happy Prince. "I am come to bid you good-bye," he cried. "Swallow, swallow, little swallow," said the Prince, "will you not stay with me 1 night longer?" "It is winter," answered the Swallow, "and the chill snow will soon be here. In Egypt the sun is warm on the green palm trees, and the crocodiles lie in the mud and look lazily about them. My companions are building a nest in the temple of Baalbec, and the pink and white doves are watching them and cooing to each other. Dear Prince, I must leave you, but I will never forget you, and next spring I will bring you back 2 beautiful jewels in place of those you have given away. The ruby shall be redder than a red rose, and the sapphire shall be as blue as the great sea." "In the square below," said the happy Prince, "there stands a little match-girl. She has let her matches fall in the gutter, and they are all spoiled. Her father will beat her if she does not bring home some money, and she is crying. She has no shoes or stockings, and her little head is bare. Pluck out my other eye and give it to her, and her father will not beat her." "I will stay with you 1 night longer," said the Swallow, "but I cannot pluck out your eye. You would be quite blind then." "Swallow, swallow, little swallow," said the Prince, "do as I command you." So he plucked out the Prince's other eye and darted down with it. He swooped past the match-girl and slipped the jewel into the palm of her hand. "What a lovely bit of glass!" cried the little girl, and she ran home laughing. Then the Swallow came back to the Prince. "You are blind now," he said, "so I will stay with you always." "No, little Swallow," said the poor Prince, "you must go away to Egypt." "I will stay with you always," said the Swallow, and he slept at the Prince's feet. All the next day he sat on the Prince's shoulder and told him stories of what he had seen in strange lands. He told him of the red ibises who stand in long rows on the banks of the Nile, and catch goldfish in their beaks, of the Sphinx who is as old as the world itself, and lives in the desert, and knows everything, of the merchants who walk slowly by the side of their camels and carry amber beads in their hands, of the king of the mountains of the moon, who is as black as ebony and worships a large crystal, of the great green snake that sleeps in a palm tree and has 20 priests to feed it with honey cakes, and of the pygmies who sail over a big lake on large flat leaves and are always at war with the butterflies. "Dear little Swallow," said the Prince, "you tell me of marvellous things, but more marvellous than anything is the suffering of men and of women. There is no mystery so great as misery. Fly over my city, little Swallow, and tell me what you see there." So the swallow flew over the great city, and saw the rich making merry in their beautiful houses, while the beggars were sitting at the gates. He flew into dark lanes, and saw the white faces of starving children looking out listlessly at the black streets. Under the archway of a bridge, 2 little boys were lying in one another's arms to try and keep themselves warm. "How hungry we are," they said. "You must not lie here," shouted the watchman, and they wandered out into the rain. Then he flew back and told the prince what he had seen. "I am covered with fine gold," said the prince. "You must take it off, leaf by leaf, and give it to my poor. The living always think that gold can make them happy." Leaf after leaf of the fine gold the swallow picked off, till the happy prince looked quite dull and grey. Leaf after leaf of the fine gold he brought to the poor, and the children's faces grew rosier, and they laughed and played games in the street. "We have bread now!" they cried. Then the snow came, and after the snow came the frost. The streets looked as if they were made of silver, they were so bright and glistening. Long icicles like crystal daggers hung down from the eaves of the houses. Everybody went about in furs, and the little boys wore scarlet caps and skated on the ice. The poor little swallow grew colder and colder, but he would not leave the prince. He loved him too well. He picked up crumbs outside the baker's door when the baker was not looking, and tried to keep himself warm by flapping his wings. But at last he knew that he was going to die. He had just strength to fly up to the prince's shoulder once more. "Goodbye, dear prince," he murmured. "Will you let me kiss your hand?" "I am glad that you are going to Egypt at last, little swallow," said the prince. "You have stayed too long here, but you must kiss me on the lips, for I love you." "It is not to Egypt that I am going," said the swallow. "I am going to the house of death. Death is the brother of sleep, is he not?" And he kissed the happy prince on the lips, and fell down dead at his feet. At that moment a curious crack sounded inside the statue, as if something had broken. The fact is that the leaden heart had snapped right in two. It certainly was a dreadfully hard frost. Early the next morning the mayor was walking in the square below in company with the town councillors. As they passed the column he looked up at the statue. "Dear me, how shabby the happy prince looks," he said. "How shabby indeed," cried the town councillors, who always agreed with the mayor, and they went up to look at it. "The ruby has fallen out of his sword, his eyes are gone, and he is golden no longer," said the mayor. "In fact, he is little better than a beggar." "Little better than a beggar," said the town councillors. "And here is actually a dead bird at his feet," continued the mayor. "We must really issue a proclamation that birds are not to be allowed to die here." And the town clerk made a note of the suggestion. So they pulled down the statue of the happy prince. "As he is no longer beautiful, he is no longer useful," said the art professor at the university. Then they melted the statue in a furnace, and the mayor held a meeting at the corporation to decide what was to be done with the metal. "We must have another statue, of course," he said, "and it shall be a statue of myself." "Of myself," said each of the town councillors, and they quarrelled. When I last heard of them, they were quarrelling still. "What a strange thing," said the overseer of the workmen at the foundry. "This broken lead heart will not melt in the furnace. We must throw it away." So they threw it on a dust heap, where the dead swallow was also lying. "Bring me the 2 most precious things in the city," said God to one of his angels, and the angel brought him the leaden heart and the dead bird. "You have rightly chosen," said God, "for in my garden of paradise this little bird shall sing for evermore, and in my city of gold the happy prince shall praise me." End of The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde. Read by David Sweeney Bear. dsbaudio.com
The Story of Blixie, Bimber, and the Power of the Gold Buckskin Whincher by Carl Sandburg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Blixie Bimber grew up looking for luck. If she found a horseshoe, she took it home and put it on the wall of her room with a ribbon tied to it. She would look at the moon through her fingers, under her arms, over her right shoulder, but never over her left shoulder. She listened and picked up everything anybody said about the groundhog, and whether the groundhog saw his shadow when he came out the 2nd of February. If she dreamed of onions, she knew the next day she would find a silver spoon. If she dreamed of fishes, she knew the next day she would meet a strange man who would call her by her first name. She grew up looking for luck. She was 16 years old and quite a girl, with her skirts down to her shoe tops, when something happened. She was going to the post office to see if there was a letter for her from Peter Potato Blossom Wishes, her best chum, or a letter from Jimmy the Flea, her best friend she kept steady company with. Jimmy the Flea was a climber. He climbed skyscrapers and flagpoles and smokestacks and was a famous steeplejack. Blixie Bimber liked him because he was a steeplejack, a little, but more because he was a whistler. Every time Blixie said to Jimmy, "I got the blues, whistle the blues out of me," Jimmy would just naturally whistle till the blues just naturally went away from Blixie. On the way to the post office, Blixie found a gold buckskin whincher. There it lay in the middle of the sidewalk. How and why it came to be there she never knew, and nobody ever told her. "It's luck," she said to herself as she picked it up quick. And so she took it home and fixed it on a little chain and wore it around her neck. She did not know, and nobody ever told her, a gold buckskin whincher is different from just a plain common whincher. It has a power, and if a thing has a power over you, then you just naturally can't help yourself. So around her neck, fixed on a little chain, Blixie Bimber wore the gold buckskin whincher and never knew it had a power, and all the time the power was working. The first man you meet with an X in his name, you must fall head over heels in love with him, said the silent power in the gold buckskin whincher. And that was why Blixie Bimber stopped at the post office and went back again, asking the clerk at the post office window if he was sure there wasn't a letter for her. The name of the clerk was Silas Baxby. For 6 weeks he kept steady company with Blixie Bimber. They went to dances, hayrack rides, picnics, and hijinks together. All the time the power in the gold buckskin whincher was working. It was hanging by a little chain around her neck, and always working. It was saying, "The next man you meet with 2 X's in his name, you must leave all and fall head over heels in love with him." She met the high school principal. His name was Fritz Axenbacks. Blixie dropped her eyes before him and threw smiles at him, and for 6 weeks he kept steady company with Blixie Bimber. They went to dances, hayrack rides, picnics, and hijinks together. "Why do you go with him for steady company?" her relatives asked. "It's a power he's got," Blixie answered. "I just can't help it. It's a power." "One of his feet is bigger than the other. How can you keep steady company with him?" they asked again. All she would answer was, "It's a power." All the time, of course, the gold buckskin whincher on the little chain around her neck was working. It was saying, if she meets a man with 3 X's in his name, she must fall head over heels in love with him. At a band concert in the public square one night, she met James Six Bix Dix. There was no helping it. She dropped her eyes and threw her smiles at him. and for 6 weeks they kept steady company, going to band concerts, dances, hayrack rides, picnics, and hijinks together. "Why do you keep steady company with him? He's a musical soup eater," her relative said to her, and she answered, "It's a power. I can't help myself." Leaning down with her head in a rainwater cistern one day, listening to the echoes against the strange wooden walls of the cistern, the gold buckskin whincher on the little chain around her neck slipped off and fell down into the rainwater. "My luck is gone," said Blixie. Then she went into the house and made 2 telephone calls. One was to James 6 Big Sticks, telling him she couldn't keep the date with him that night. The other was to Jimmy the Flea, the climber, the steeplejack. "Come on over. I got the blues, and I want you to whistle 'em away," was what she telephoned Jimmy the Flea. And so, if you ever come across a gold buckskin whincher, be careful. It's got a power. It'll make you fall head over heels in love with the next man you meet with an X in his name. Or it will do other strange things because different whinchers have different powers. End of the story of Blixie Bimber and the Power of the Gold Buckskin Whincher by Carl Sandburg. Read by Paula Messina.
Titty Mouse and Tatty Mouse by Joseph Jacobs. Titty Mouse and Tatty Mouse both live in a house. Titty Mouse went a-leasing and Tatty Mouse went a-leasing. So they both went a-leasing. Titty Mouse leased an ear of corn and Tatty Mouse leased an ear of corn. So they both leased an ear of corn. Titty Mouse made the pudding and Tatty Mouse made the pudding. So they both made the pudding. And Tatty Mouse put her pudding into the pot to boil. But when Titty went to put hers in, the pot tumbled over and scalded her to death. Then Tatty sat down and wept. Then a 3-legged stool said, "Tatty, why do you weep?" "Titty's dead," said Tatty, "and so I weep." "Then," said the stool, "I'll hop." So the stool hopped. Then a broom in the corner of the room said, "Stool, why do you hop?" "Oh," said the stool, "Titty's dead, and Tatty weeps, and so I hop." "Then," said the broom, "I'll sweep." So the broom began to sweep. "Then," said the door, "Broom, why do you sweep?" "Oh," said the broom, "Titty's dead, and Tatty weeps, and the stool hops, and so I sweep." "Then," said the door, "I'll shar." So the door sharred. "Then," said the window, "Door, why do you shar?" "Oh," said the door, "Titty's dead, and Tatty weeps, and the stool hops, and the broom sweeps, and so I shar." "Then," said the window, "I'll creak." So the window creaked. Now, there was an old form outside the house, and when the window creaked, the form said, "Window, why do you creak?" "Oh," said the window, "Titty's dead, and Tatty weeps, and the stool hops, and the broom sweeps, the door shars, and so I creak." Then, said the old form, I'll run round the house. Then the old form ran round the house. Now, there was a fine large walnut tree growing by the cottage, and the tree said to the form, Form, why do you run round the house? Oh, said the form, Titty's dead, and Tatty weeps, and the stool hops, and the broom sweeps, the door shuts, and the window creaks, and so I run round the house. Then, said the walnut tree, I'll shed my leaves. So the walnut tree shed all its beautiful green leaves. Now, there was a little bird perched on one of the boughs of the tree, and when all the leaves fell, it said, Walnut tree, why do you shed your leaves? Oh, said the tree, Titty's dead, and Tatty weeps. The stool hops, and the broom sweeps. The door shuts, and the window creaks. The old form runs round the house, and so I shed my leaves. Then, said the little bird, I'll moult all my feathers. So he moulted all his pretty feathers. Now, there was a little girl walking below, carrying a jug of milk for her brothers and sisters' supper. And when she saw the poor little bird moult all its feathers, she said, Little bird, why do you moult all your feathers? Oh, said the little bird, Titty's dead, and Tatty weeps. The stool hops, and the broom sweeps. The door shuts, and the window creaks. The old form runs round the house. The walnut tree shed its leaves, and so I moult all my feathers. Then, said the little girl, I'll spill the milk. So she dropped the pitcher and spilled the milk. Now, there was an old man just by on the top of a ladder touching a rick, and when he saw the little girl spill the milk, he said, Little girl, what do you mean by spilling the milk? Your little brothers and sisters must go without their supper. Then said the little girl, Titty's dead, and Tatty weeps. The stool hops, and the broom sweeps. The door shuts, and the window creaks. The old form runs round the house. The walnut tree sheds all its leaves. The little bird moults all its feathers. And so I spill the milk. Oh, said the old man, then I'll tumble off the ladder and break my neck. So he tumbled off the ladder and broke his neck. And when the old man broke his neck, the great walnut tree fell down with a crash and upset the old form and house. And the house falling knocked the window out, and the window knocked the door down, and the door upset the broom, and the broom upset the stool, and poor little Tatty Mouse was buried beneath the ruins. End of Titty Mouse and Tatty Mouse by Joseph Jacobs. Read for LibriVox by Víctor Villarraza.
The Story of the Man Who Did Not Wish to Die, selected from the work entitled Japanese Fairy Tales. Compiled by Ye Theodora Osaki. Translated by Sadanami Sanjin. Read by Andrea Bourne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Long, long ago, there lived a man called Sentaro. His surname meant millionaire, but although he was not so rich as all that, he was still very far removed from being poor. He had inherited a small fortune from his father, and lived on this, spending his time carelessly, without any serious thoughts of work, till he was about 32 years of age. One day, without any reason whatsoever, the thought of death and sickness came to him. The idea of falling ill or dying made him very wretched. I should like to live, he said to himself, till I am 500 or 600 years old at least, free from all sickness. The ordinary span of a man's life is very short. He wondered whether it were possible by living simply and frugally henceforth to prolong his life as long as he wished. He knew there were many stories in ancient history of emperors who had lived 1,000 years, and there was a princess of Yamato who, it was said, lived to the age of 500. This was the latest story of a very long life record. Sentaro had often heard the tale of the Chinese king named Shinoshiko. He was one of the most able and powerful rulers in Chinese history. He built all the large palaces and also the famous Great Wall of China. He had everything in the world he could wish for, but in spite of all his happiness and the luxury and the splendor of his court, the wisdom of his counselors, and the glory of his reign, he was miserable because he knew that one day he must die and leave it all. When Shinoshiko went to bed at night, when he rose in the morning, as he went through his day, the thought of death was always with him. He could not get away from it. Ah, if only he could find the elixir of life, he would be happy. The emperor at last called a meeting of his courtiers and asked them all if they could not find for him the elixir of life, of which he had so often read and heard. One old courtier, Jofuku by name, said that far away across the seas there was a country called Horizon, and that certain hermits lived there who possessed the secret of the elixir of life. Whoever drank of this wonderful draught lived forever. The emperor ordered Jofuku to set out for the land of Horizon to find the hermits, and to bring him back a phial of the magic elixir. He gave Jofuku one of his best junks, fitted it out for him, and loaded it with great quantities of treasures and precious stones for Jofuku to take as presents to the hermits. Jofuku sailed for the land of Horizon, but he never returned to the waiting emperor. But ever since that time, Mount Fuji has been said to be the fabled Horizon, and the home of hermits who had the secret of the elixir, and Jofuku has been worshipped as their patron god. Now Sentaro determined to set out to find the hermits, and if he could, to become one, so that he might obtain the water of perpetual life. He remembered that as a child he had been told that not only did these hermits live on Mount Fuji, but that they were said to inhabit all of the very high peaks. So he left his old home to take care of his relatives, and started out on his quest. He traveled through all the mountainous regions of the land, climbing to the tops of the highest peaks, but never a hermit did he find. At last, after wandering in an unknown region for many days, he met a hunter. "Can you tell me," asked Sentaro, "where the hermits live who have the elixir of life?" "No," said the hunter, "I can't tell you where such hermits live, but there is a notorious robber living in these parts. It is said that he is chief of a band of 200 followers." This odd answer irritated Sentaro very much, and he thought how foolish it was to waste more time in looking for the hermits in this way. So he decided to go at once to the shrine of Jofuku, who is worshipped as the patron god of the hermits in the south of Japan. Sentaro reached the shrine and prayed for 7 days, entreating Jofuku to show him the way to a hermit who could give him much of what he wanted. At midnight of the 7th day, as Sentaro knelt in the temple, the door of the innermost shrine flew open, and Jofuku appeared in a luminous cloud, and calling to Sentaro to come nearer, spoke thus. Your desire is very selfish, and cannot be easily granted. You think that you would like to become a hermit, so as to find the elixir of life. Do you know how hard a hermit's life is? A hermit is only allowed to eat fruit and berries and the bark of a pine tree. A hermit must cut himself off from the world so that his heart may become as pure as gold and free from every earthly desire. Gradually, after following these strict rules, the hermit ceases to feel hunger or cold or heat, and his body becomes so light that he can ride on a crane or a carp and can walk on water without getting his feet wet. You, Sentaro, are fond of good living and of every comfort. You are not even like an ordinary man, for you are exceptionally idle and more sensitive to heat and cold than most people. You would never be able to go barefoot, or to wear only one thin dress in the winter time. Do you think that you would ever have the patience or the endurance to live a hermit's life? In answer to your prayer, however, I will help you in another way. I will send you to the country of perpetual life, where death never comes, where the people live forever. Saying this, Jofuku put into Sentaro's hand a little crane made of paper, telling him to sit on its back, and it would carry him there. Sentaro obeyed wonderingly. The crane grew large enough for him to ride on it with comfort. It then spread its wings, rose high in the air, and flew away over the mountains, right out to sea. Sentaro was at first quite frightened, but by degrees he grew accustomed to the swift flight through the air. On and on they went for thousands of miles. The bird never stopped for rest or food. But as it was a paper bird, it doubtless did not require any nourishment, and strange to say, neither did Sentaro. After several days they reached an island. The crane flew some distance inland, and then alighted. As soon as Sentaro got down from the bird's back, the crane folded up of its own accord and flew into his pocket. Now Sentaro began to look about him wonderingly, curious to see what the country of perpetual life was like. He walked first round the country, and then through the town. Everything was, of course, quite strange and different from his own land. But both the land and the people seemed prosperous, so he decided that it would be good for him to stay there, and took up lodgings at one of the hotels. The proprietor was a kind man, and when Sentaro told him that he was a stranger and had come to live there, he promised to arrange everything that was necessary with the governor of the city concerning Sentaro's sojourn there. He even found a house for his guest, and in this way Sentaro obtained his great wish and became a resident in the country of perpetual life. Within the memory of all the islanders, no man had ever died there, and sickness was a thing unknown. Priests had come over from India and China and told them of a beautiful country called Paradise, where happiness and bliss and contentment fill all men's hearts, but its gates could only be reached by dying. This tradition was handed down for ages from generation to generation, but none knew exactly what death was, except that it led to paradise. Quite unlike Sentaro and other ordinary people, instead of having a great dread of death, they all, both rich and poor, longed for it as something good and desirable. They were all tired of their long, long lives, and longed to go to the happy land of contentment called Paradise, of which the priests had told them centuries ago. All this Sentaro soon found out by talking to the islanders. He found himself, according to his ideas, in the land of topsy-turvydom. Everything was upside down. He had wished to escape from dying. He had come to the land of perpetual life with great relief and joy, only to find that the inhabitants themselves, doomed never to die, would consider it bliss to find death. What he had hitherto considered poison, these people ate as good food, and all the things to which he had been accustomed as food they rejected. Whenever any merchants from other countries arrived, the rich people rushed to them eager to buy poisons. These they swallowed eagerly, hoping for death to come so that they might go to paradise. But what were deadly poisons in other lands were without effect in this strange place, and people who swallowed them with the hope of dying only found that they in a short time felt better in health instead of worse. Vainly they tried to imagine what death could be like. The wealthy would have given all their money and all of their goods if they could shorten their lives to 200 or 300 years even. Without any change, to live on forever seemed to this people wearisome and sad. In the chemist shops, there was a drug which was in constant demand because after using it for 100 years, it was supposed to turn the hair slightly gray and to bring about disorders of the stomach. Sentaro was astonished to find that the poisonous globefish was served up in restaurants as a delectable dish, and hawkers in the streets went about selling sauces made of Spanish flies. He never saw anyone ill after eating these horrible things, nor did he ever see anyone with as much as a cold. Sentaro was delighted. He said to himself that he would never grow tired of living, and that he considered it profane to wish for death. He was the only happy man on the island. For his part, he wished to live thousands of years, and to enjoy life. He set himself up in business, and for the present never even dreamed of going back to his native land. As years went by, however, things did not go as smoothly as at first. He had heavy losses in business, and several times some affairs went wrong with his neighbors. This caused him great annoyance. Time passed like the flight of an arrow for him, for he was busy from morning till night. 300 years went by in this monotonous way, and then at last he began to grow tired of life in this country, and he longed to see his own land and his old home. However long he lived here, life would always be the same. So was it not foolish and wearisome to stay on here forever? Sentaro, in his wish to escape from the country of perpetual life, recollected Jofuku, who had helped him before when he was wishing to escape from death, and he prayed to the saint to bring him back to his own land again. No sooner did he pray than the paper crane popped out of his pocket. Sentaro was amazed to see that it had remained undamaged after all of these years. Once more the bird grew and grew till it was large enough for him to mount it. As he did so, the bird spread its wings and flew swiftly out across the sea in the direction of Japan. Such was the willfulness of the man's nature that he looked back and regretted all he had left behind. He tried to stop the bird in vain. The crane held on its way for thousands of miles across the ocean. Then a storm came on, and the wonderful paper crane got damp, crumpled up, and fell into the sea. Sentaro fell with it. Very much frightened at the thought of being drowned, he cried out loudly to Jofuku to save him. He looked round, but there was no ship in sight. He swallowed a quantity of sea-water, which only increased his miserable plight. While he was thus struggling to keep himself afloat, he saw a monstrous shark swimming towards him. As it came nearer, it opened its huge mouth, ready to devour him. Sentaro was all but paralyzed with fear now that he felt his end so near, and screamed out as loudly as ever he could to Jofuku to come and rescue him. Lo and behold, Sentaro was awakened by his own screams, to find that during his long prayer he had fallen asleep before the shrine, and that all his extraordinary and frightful adventures had only been a wild dream. He was in a cold perspiration with fright, and utterly bewildered. Suddenly a bright light came towards him, and in the light stood a messenger. The messenger held a book in his hand and spoke to Sentaro. I am sent to you by Jofuku, who in answer to your prayer has permitted you in a dream to see the land of perpetual life. But you grew weary of living there, and begged to be allowed to return to your native land, so that you might die. Jofuku, so that he might try you, allowed you to drop into the sea, and then sent a shark to swallow you up. Your desire for death was not real, for even at that moment you cried out loudly, and shouted for help. It is also vain for you to wish to become a hermit, or to find the elixir of life. These things are not for such as you. Your life is not austere enough. It is best for you to go back to your paternal home, and to live a good and industrious life. Never neglect to keep the anniversaries of your ancestors, and make it your duty to provide for your children's future. Thus will you live to a good old age and be happy. But give up the vain desire to escape death, for no man can do that. And by this time you have surely found out that even when selfish desires are granted, they do not bring happiness. In this book I give you, there are many precepts good for you to know. If you study them, you will be guided in the way I have pointed out to you. The angel disappeared as soon as he had finished speaking, and Sentaro took the lesson to heart. With the book in his hand, he returned to his old home, and giving up all his old vain wishes, tried to live a good and useful life, and to observe the lessons taught him in the book, and he and his house prospered henceforth. End of the story of the man who did not wish to die, selected from the work entitled Japanese Fairy Tales, compiled by Yae Theodora Osaki, translated by Sadanami Sanjin, read by Andrea Bourne.